Hello everyone. Today we are going to be covering Genesis, or in Hebrew, B'resheet. It is the very first Torah portion of the year, and as we are beginning a new cycle, this is where we come back to. It's interesting to note that Genesis is a Greek word which means origin, but B'resheet, the Hebrew, it's beginning, right? So same kind of connotation here. But it's interesting to note that in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, we say, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And this is kind of where our focus is going to be. We're probably only going to get through the first 1 to 2 chapters of Genesis. We're not going to go through a lot of the detail, but there's a few points from these 2 chapters that I want to highlight that I think are foundational to our understanding of morality and our understanding of free will. So that's kind of where we're going to hang out for this Torah portion. But when it talks about in the beginning that God created the heavens and the earth, right? This statement establishes Scripture's not just a set of rules, a set of do's and don'ts. It sets it up as the very foundation of what we believe, why we believe, how we behave, the world around us, right? It begins to peel back these layers so we can understand the creation that we all exist in. Now, it's God's blueprint for creation, essentially, is what we're talking about. And so if that's the case, if we get a glimpse of how the Father made the world, then we begin to see that every aspect, every function, every detail has a divine purpose, right? And sometimes we don't always think of things in this manner. We think of, more abstract. But if God is the divine architect, if you will, then everything that He created has a purpose. Now, to the degree that we understand these purposes is to the same degree which we'll understand not only the world we live in, but our Creator, His will, and His, what's the word I'm looking for? His desire for how we should interact with this creation and interact with Him. So that's kind of what we're going to look at in this Torah portion. So what's interesting to me, especially in the first chapter, is we're talking about divine architecture, right? Why did God make the world the way He made it, right? Why do we have to breathe air? Why do we have water or earth? Why aren't we floating around in space somewhere? He could have done a whole host of different things. Why did He choose what He chose? Now, a lot of the things that we see in creation, we see a duality. We see, I would call it balance, right? When you have 2 opposites that are equal, they balance each other out. And we see a lot of this in Scripture, especially in this first aspects of creation as you read through that. So what do we have? Elements of light and dark. We have man and woman, right? We have earth and sky. And also, even in the garden, when He created the Garden of Eden, He had the whole earth created. He could have just said, Adam, you've got the whole earth. But He said, no, I'm going to make a special place that is separate just for you. So again, we have these distinctions that are made, these divisions, these separations that are made throughout the creation narrative. Now, it's interesting that a lot of these distinctions, we would call them opposing forces, right? Light opposes darkness. A lot of times we see in relationships, right? A woman and man, they oppose one another. Ideally, we should be coming together in that sense, but a lot of times there is an opposition there because they're equal, but they're different, right? They bring balance to each other when everything's in a proper relationship and alignment, but when it's out of alignment, they're opposing forces. We see a lot of these things. But we see natural and spiritual forces that are divided or separated from one another, and in some cases actually oppose one another. Why is this? Well, one of the things that we're really going to talk about is this idea of choice. How do we get choice? from creation. And you're probably sitting there, what are you talking about? I thought we were talking about creation. Now you're talking about choice. What's going on? Let me clarify here. The tension between opposites creates choice, right? So mankind, us, creation, man and woman, we exist in this tensional creation with the ability to choose good or evil, right? Because we know that sin exists and we know God's will exists. So we can choose one between the other. But again, you have to have these distinctions made. So our ability to choose reveals God's gift of will, God's gift of free will. Because there's choice, we're free. And this is what I wanted to kind of talk about. You see, if we didn't have choice, right? If God didn't put the tree in the middle of the garden and say, don't eat from that tree, now man is presented with a choice. You can live here and exist with me and be obedient to me, or you can eat from this tree in disobedience. But you have to make the choice for yourself, right? Now that offers man a sort of freedom, right? Now he is free to either choose, obey or rebel, right? Because if he didn't have that choice, then is he really free? He has no other alternative but to obey because there's no other alternative, right? So that's not really freedom. So this is where we get another glimpse of God's grace to man to create him as a free entity. So even all the way back in creation, we see that God offers grace to man, right? A lot of times we think of grace as a New Testament concept, but it's right here in what we would call the Old Testament or the Old Covenant, if you will. God's grace exists. He made man free to choose him or free to reject him. Now it's the Father's desire that we choose him, but he gives us that ability to choose. And so this kind of choice is our foundation for us understanding moral reasoning. It's how we understand the world around us. And this is what I want to talk about with creation. Is see, when God creates things that would be seemingly opposite, seemingly oppose one another, right? Things that would, in our mind, might even seem like, and this is kind of a negative, Lord, why did you do this? A lot of times it relates back to giving us the option of choice, which is in essence a way of giving us freedom. God didn't want to make slaves. He didn't want to make robots. He wanted to make man in his image to be free and to be able to willingly choose him, right? We see this thing in ideal relationships, right? We don't want somebody that is coerced and forced upon us, right? That's not freedom. That's slavery. What we want is somebody that will willingly choose us, willingly partner with us, willingly come into alignment and relationship with us. So that way we can both mutually be blessed by the relationship. So let's keep going. Chapter 1, let me read the first few verses. We're going to read chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. And I've got my notes here. I don't know if you can see that or not, but that's what we're doing. So, B'resheet, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was unformed and void. Darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the surface of the water. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. So there was evening and there was morning one day. So let's take a pause right there. So in the opening passages, we already have a division. We have light and darkness. Now, this gets really interesting when you look at it with the Hebrew. And that's kind of what we're going to take a peek at here. So in verses 1 through 4, we have the word light. When we see light, that's the Hebrew word or, okay? And what does that mean? It means illumination that comes from God. It's the source of spiritual enlightenment that leads to life. So what we have here is when it says God made the light, he made the spiritual enlightenment that leads to life. We're not talking about physical light yet. This concept is really interesting. We're not talking about light that we can see, light that lights up a room or anything like that. We're talking about a spiritual reality. The first thing he creates is a spiritual reality that's separate from another spiritual reality. Right? Darkness. The Hebrew word used here for darkness is hosek. Right? Hosek. And it means falsehood, ignorance, spiritual blindness that leads to misery and death. Now, what did we just read here? That in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Right? And then in verse 3, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good and divided the light from the darkness. So God created everything. He created the light and divided it from darkness. So we already have these two spiritual realities from the foundation of creation. We have this spiritual light, or, right, illumination that comes and emanates from God, this spiritual enlightenment that leads to life. And then we have darkness, hosek, which is the opposite of that. Okay? So this gets very interesting. Now, we keep reading in the chapter and we get all the way down to verse 14. Right? We have some more creation aspects, then we get to verse 14. And it says here, God said, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to divide the day from the night. Let them be for signs, seasons, days, and years. And let them be for lights in the dome of the sky to give light to the earth." And that's how it was. And it goes on from there. But now we have some different Hebrew words here. So for light, from verse 14, the word light or day is ma'orot. Right? We have that or right in the middle, but it's ma'orot. And it's plural, which means objects that emit light waves, right? Physical. We're talking about the light that we can see, right? The light from the sun, the light from the stars, right? Things that illuminate. So physical light, the tangible sense. And this Hebrew word has no spiritual connotation. It's just a fact of reality, an aspect of physics, if you will. It's just light. And then darkness, or night, which is the Hebrew word leil. And that's just merely the opposite of day. It's the natural absence of light. There's no light around, so it's dark. And again, we're talking physical. It has no spiritual connotation. So in the beginning of Genesis, we have a spiritual division. And then later in the creation story, that's when we actually get physical light and darkness. Before, we have a spiritual light and a spiritual darkness. We have two distinct separations here. Now in verse 5, we kind of go back. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. So there was evening and there was morning, one day, right? Now this is referring back to the physical aspects we see, right? Not necessarily the spiritual realities, but we have physical light and darkness. And we use it for times and seasons, etc., etc. But by creating a division, God created the day, thereby granting us time, right? How do we divide time? The rotations of the earth, when it's light versus dark, right? 24 hours in a day, etc., etc. This is how we divide the days, one day from another, and months from years, all like that. So now we have an understanding of time. And then evening to morning, it's interesting to know, why do Hebraics, like ourselves, why do we say that the day starts in the evening? Well, this is why. It's evening to morning is one day. Most Western cultures, Greek mindset, if you will, however you want to phrase it, we think of the day starting in the morning when the sun rises. But actually the start of the day is at sunset, and it ends at sunrise the next day. So that's pretty interesting. But here we see God establish two opposing spiritual realities, light and darkness, which mirror the natural equivalents of day and night. Now here we come back to the issue of choice. Mankind has the power to choose which spiritual reality he will adopt. This was from the foundation. He hasn't even created man yet. And here we are. There's two existing spiritual realities. And so he can either adopt God's ways of light or, the Hebrew word or, that spiritual enlightenment, or he can choose that which opposes God's ways, darkness or chosek, that spiritual blindness that leads to death. So again, we have choice, which in turn provides freedom. Now, we go to chapter 2, and we actually get to the creation of man. So let's read chapter 2, verse 7 here. It says, "Then Adonai, God, formed a person," which is Adam in Hebrew, "from the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, so that he became a living being." We'll stop right there. So God made man. He made him in his image. And initially he made him singular. There was just one man, right? Eve hadn't shown up yet. She wasn't created yet. But now we know, reading on, that God did not desire Adam to be alone, so he made a helpmeet for him. But see, what's interesting, why did he have to make a helpmeet, right? We've got other animals that are what we would call asexual. They can reproduce on their own. They don't need a mate. They don't need a counterpart. But yet we have man. Why was man made alone? Well, as an individual, as a singular individual, he's without challenge. He's got nothing like him to challenge him, right? And when you're not challenged, there's no potential for growth, right? There's nothing to stress you, to stretch you, to push you, to elevate yourself, to reach for something beyond yourself. And so, verse 18, we'll jump down there and let's read that. We see God makes woman. Adonai, God said, "It isn't good that the person," referring to man, "should be alone. I will make for him a companion suitable for him." So God knew that man could not reach his full potential on his own, so he created an opposite, right? A woman. So a woman is similar to man, but she's also fundamentally different, right? We know biologically a woman is different. Emotionally, a woman is different. And even the way men and women think are different than one another. Why is that? Why didn't God just make them to think alike and be identical? Well, again, there's no challenge. There's nothing to push the man to achieve for something greater than himself. And likewise for the woman, there's no challenge for her to be pushed to something higher than herself. Now, when we get into some commentary, rabbinical commentary, it talks about how the woman is supposed to be a complement, a helpmeet, right? We've heard that phrase before in Christian circles, that she's to be a helpmeet for him. She's to help him to reach his potential, help him to reach his goals, because then they both mutually benefit, and they both have strengths that they can bring to one another to offset each other's weaknesses. But in rabbinical commentary, it talks about, this is interesting to me, it says if a man is worthy, right, if he's righteous, upright, if he's doing the things that a man is supposed to do, living his ideal life, the way that God designed him to live, if he's worthy in that sense, then the woman is a help to him, right? She's an asset, she's a companion, she's that helpmeet that he needs. But if the man is unworthy, if he's not living up to his potential, if he's not living the way that he's supposed to live, he's not doing the things that God designed him to do, then the woman will oppose him. And it's interesting, we live in a day and age with relationships between men and women that are very antagonistic, right? And I think this is a manipulation from the enemy, but men and women more oppose each other than try to assist one another. And why is that? Well, when you really look at it, we see over years, especially in Western culture, men have been feminized and women have been masculinized. I don't know if that's even a word, but anyway, they become more masculine, right? So men have become more like women and women have become more like men, throwing everything out of balance. And now women, they desire strong men who will protect, provide, and preside over them, right, to be leaders for them, but yet they have to fill all these masculine roles. And so they begin to resent men and they begin to oppose them. And we see this, and it plays out in relationships, and we have a lot of broken relationships and broken homes, broken marriages, these kinds of things. And I believe that's a work of the enemy to keep man and woman apart when God clearly designed them to come together in a beautiful relationship. But here we have, even in an ideal scenario, we have the potential, and that's a key word, potential for relational adversity. It serves as a mechanism to challenge man to reach his higher potential. And I would say challenge woman as well, right? When a man and a woman come together in marriage and they begin to build a family, the man thinks one way, the woman thinks one way, right? They're not always on the same page, but they have to learn to work together to reach a goal that's beyond both of them. And we do this with the help of the Father. We do this when we walk in His ways. And then there's balance there, right? Men don't approach things the way a woman does. Woman doesn't approach things the way a man does. They both express their emotions differently. But when they come together, not one side dominates, but there's a balance there. They learn to work together. Two opposites, if you will, learning to come together and work in harmony to reach a higher potential than either one of them could reach on their own. Now, there's another idea here, and this is a rabbinical idea or Hebraic idea, if you will. But in Hebraic thought, humility, this concept of humility, is formed with two opposing impulses. Now again, who made man? The Father made man, and He made woman, right? So what they're talking about here is this is the ideal of creation. This is how God designed us to be. He put within us two impulses, right? The first one is Yetzer Hatov, which is the good impulse. This is what we call our moral conscience. This is the impulse that aligns with God's precepts, with His will, His desires. It's that part of us that wants to please the Father and walk in His ways. And then we have the Yetzer Hara, which is considered the evil impulse. Now, we have to be very careful how we think about this. It's conceived as the selfish nature, which is the desire to satisfy personal needs without regard for any moral consequence. So we don't necessarily want to equate this with sin or evil itself, but it's more of, I need to fulfill what my requirements, my needs, my desires, but I'm going to be tempted to do so in a way that would put aside God's precepts, put aside His requirements, etc., right? Western Christian thought would equate the Yetzer Hara, the evil impulse, as the sinful nature or the fallen man. But I don't really like that interpretation because the inclination, Yetzer Hara, is not necessarily an inclination or a desire to do willful evil, right? It's just you're more saying, I'm going to look out for number one to the exclusion of other inputs. right? That's more of what we're talking about. So it's not quite so nefarious as we might want to ascribe to it. But again, in Hebraic thought, this is how God made man. He gave us these dueling impulses. You know, it's interesting, for those of you who know me, you know I'm a science fiction buff. I like a lot of movies. And there was a movie came out a while back, and it was about this robot. And most robots, they have to live within a certain parameters, right? They can't harm people. They can't do these certain things because of these laws that are programmed or hardwired into them. But then this scientist, he put, instead of the one brain in the robot that has to follow these precepts, these limitations, he put in another one that didn't have this programming, and he put two brains inside this robot that would compete against each other. And by doing that, then the robot had free will, and it could enact its free will despite having a set of rules that it couldn't violate, and then, you know, having the ability to violate those rules within himself. I thought it was a perfect picture of what we're talking about here. The Yetzer HaTov, the good impulse, and the Yetzer Hara, the selfish impulse, that are both inside man. And it gives us that ability to choose. It's the engine that drives our free will. Now, these two natures provide balance when properly controlled by the good impulse. Okay? Hatov, the evil impulse, when properly balanced, leads to socially desirable results, right? I have a selfish need where I want a wife. I want a helpmeet for myself. So what happens? I have to go out and find one. I'm motivated to find one. But now if I'm balanced by the good impulse, by my desire to please the Father and live within His precepts, I'm going to satisfy that impulse, that selfish desire, if you will, to want a mate, but do it and enact it in such a way that is pleasing to the Father, right? It's saying, you know, if I want possessions, right? I want a house to live in, I want a car to drive, I want clothes to wear, all these things. Well, I can go out and get all these things and do it in a way that hurts people, disregards people, you know, and those around me in an unrighteous means, or I can do it in a righteous manner. You know, I can acquire for myself things without having things acquiring me, if you will. So these natures, when controlled by the good impulse, can be very beneficial. It causes us to have that drive to pursue things greater than ourselves. And thus these two natures, as we said earlier, they provide free will. And then when we have free will, we can be rewarded for our choices, or we can suffer the consequences for our choices. But there are choices. And these two natures, we go to Genesis chapter 1, verses 31, right? We're backing up a little bit. Chapter 1, verse 31. God saw everything that He had made, and indeed it was very good. You know, talking about all these separations, you know, talking about creation itself, these distinctions that were made in creation. God says, this is good, right? When I created the two spiritual realities, right? We almost get the idea that darkness actually pre-existed, and then He made light. He made a separation there. But He says it's good. He says having two spiritual realities, one that leads to life and one that leads to death, is good. This is what He says about His creation. Now, that brings us to this next point of freedom of choice. Why would it be good that God created a spiritual reality or a potential that would lead us to death? Why would that be good? God's plan for man as it relates to creation necessarily allows for the potential of evil. And again, that's a key word. It allows for the potential of evil. man's evil inclination or selfish inclination, Yetzer Hara, exists so that our conformity to free will have meaning and significance. What does this mean? So let's talk about the tree in the middle of the garden, right? God makes man, he makes woman, he puts them in the garden, the separate place, and then he says, you can eat anything in this garden. You have full access, no limitations. Furthermore, I want you to cultivate, till the garden, right? Work the garden. It's yours. Have dominion over it. Except for this one tree, right? The one tree, I don't want you to touch it. I don't want you to eat from it. I want you to leave it alone. Now, why would the Father do that? When we have perfection, right? When Scripture talks about how the Father came down and walked and talked with them in the cool of the evening. They have this perfect relationship in this perfect place. Why would the Father jeopardize that by placing an object that has the potential to destroy everything? Well, that gives man free will. See, if that tree didn't exist, man couldn't rebel. He had no means to rebel. He had no means to disobey. And therefore, he had no choice. He was a slave. He had no choice but to be with God in the way that God wanted him to be. It was not a choice. It was slavery. And God says, I don't want slaves. I don't want robots. I want somebody to freely desire me for who I am. I want my creation to want me back. Right? And so I have to place something in that allows for the potential. I don't desire that they eat from the tree. I've told them this much. I don't desire for them to do that. But I have to give them the opportunity, the option of disobeying me, of choosing something other than me. Because otherwise their choice would not be genuine. And that's what we're talking about. So God's plan for creation didn't require evil activity. It just had to have the potential to do so. Right? God desires that we don't sin. He desires that we choose him. But he gives us the opportunity to choose. A lot of times when people suffer tragedy and hard things in life, they say, if God loves us, why does he allow this bad thing to happen to me, right? Why does he allow evil in the world and suffering in the world? How can he be a good and benevolent God if he allows these things to happen, right? We look at tragedies across the globe and how people suffer and all these things. Why would a loving God do that? Well, again, going all the way back to creation, to Genesis, to B'resheet, God's plan doesn't require evil. God doesn't want these things to happen, but he allows them to happen because he has to allow for the potential of disobedience. So that way, when we do choose him, it's genuine. When we choose to walk in his ways, it's genuine. Now, a lot of people struggle with that concept because, as limited human beings, we struggle with this existence of sin and fallenness and brokenness in our world, right? Especially if we're the recipients of pain and suffering. God, why'd you allow that to happen? What did I do? But the person that hurt us, right? Or the people that caused the events that caused us harm to happen, he gives them the same potential to choose him or deny him. And some people in this world choose to not walk with the Father. They choose to walk in rebellion to his ways. And that causes harm and destruction for others. So as we still struggle with these concepts, it's enough for us to understand that God does not manufacture evil. Right? He doesn't create evil and just throw it out there and let it run rampant. But ultimately, evil is merely the result of God defining what good is. He says, this thing here is good, Therefore, everything that is not this is not good. It's evil, right? So evil is a construct of merely God defining what good is. Whatever good is, whatever's not that becomes evil. And then evil, in our sense, as it relates to suffering and things like that, evil is merely the reality of choosing that which God, or that which is opposed to God, right? That which is doesn't have God in it, the absence of God, which is really another way of saying that which rejects God. That's what evil is. It's rejection of the Father. God says, love your neighbor, right? And then we say, no, I don't want to do that, and so I go out and I hurt my neighbor. Freedom of choice has been granted to man by the existence of sin. Without choice, there can be no sin, right? If we don't have the opportunity to sin, then there is no choice. And without choice, there's no freedom. So again, God's plan doesn't require that evil happens, but it has to allow for the potential of it. Otherwise, we're not free. Now, let's talk about the original sin. Let's talk about sin in the world. The fall of man was because he believed the serpent. The serpent implied that God was withholding something from them. Hasatan, or Satan, he planted a seed of doubt to coerce Eve to choose to violate God's law. He didn't force her to do it. He couldn't force her to do it, because then it would be manipulation. It wouldn't have been sin on her part. She was forced. But what did he do? He planted a seed of doubt because he knew she had free will, she could choose, and so he used that choice to influence her to come one direction versus another, to choose the darkness instead of the light, to choose a selfish way of being versus God's way of being. Right? So the original sin, which I would argue all sin ultimately traces its roots back to, is not eating the fruit, but choosing a way that is opposed to God's way. That's the foundational sin that every other sin traces its root back to. We're choosing to willfully violate God's commands. You see, when we choose to violate God's will, we're telling God, we're telling Father that we know better than what He does. I can decide for myself because I know better than what you do. We're telling the Father that our will is greater than His will, that our will is somehow more valid than His. And so when we sin, we're choosing our own self-sufficiency, right? We talked about that, the two natures, the Yetzer Hara, right, the selfish impulse. We're choosing that over being spiritually dependent upon the Father, which is rejection. We're saying, I'm going to depend on myself. I'm going to go my own way, and I'm not going to be spiritually dependent on the one that created me, on the one that's greater than I am. Because somewhere in my mind or in my heart, I don't believe He's greater than me. Right? I'm rejecting the fact that God is greater than I am, so I'm going to choose my own way. And I'm going to walk in darkness. I'm not going to walk in His light. Which ultimately, that leads to death. You know, people would say, well, how can a loving God send people to hell, right? How can He send people to this eternal punishment? Well, God doesn't send people there. People send themselves there because they live a life of choices that consistently chooses ways that oppose God. God says, don't walk that way. It's not good for you. And they say, I'm going that way anyway. And so they reject God. They send a spiritual message to the Father that I don't want to be in relationship with you. And then the Father says, well, in eternity, you have shown that you don't want to have a relationship with me. So I'm going to put you in a place where there is no relationship with me. And if he's the light, if he's that spiritual reality that leads to life, then what is opposite of him? Darkness, right? Pain, suffering, that which leads to death. We choose that for ourselves when we willfully walk and live in sin. So God doesn't send anybody to eternal punishment. We send ourselves there because we consistently tell the Father, I don't want you, I don't need you. And he says, okay, I'm giving you exactly what you said you wanted. So now, this original sin, when Eve was coerced and she chose to violate the command, that gave Hasatan, that gave Satan, a legal right, if you will, to curse humanity. Right? So if we all stem from Adam and Eve, right? We all come from them. They were the foundation. They were the start. And we both chose, Adam and Eve both chose to violate the command. Now, Hasatan, he has this legal right. He says, look, your offspring, that which you created, if you will, they have chosen to rebel against you. And since they've rebelled against you, since they've willfully separated themselves from you, now I have access to do what I want to do with them. Because they no longer want to be under your protection. He had a legal right to curse humanity. But then, what happens? What did the Father do? He says, you know what? He says, I allowed for the potential of evil, the hope that man wouldn't choose it. I instructed them not to do so, but they did so anyway. He says, okay, I'm going to fix this. He says, I'm going to step in. And so what does he do? He sends his only son, Yeshua. Yeshua's work on the cross that rescinded the curse and opened the way for salvation. It was a way that we could restore that broken relationship. Right? It says there has to be a penalty for sin. Right? We have free will, we can choose, but there's consequences to our choices. If we choose that which is not aligned with the Father, that which goes into the way of darkness, our consequence is death. Right? Going back to the beginning with right? Illumination that comes from God, the spiritual enlightenment. If we don't walk in that, if we choose Hosek, the falsehood, that spiritual blindness that leads to misery and death, if we walk in that, if we choose that, then the consequence is separation from God and death. Well, the Father said, I don't want that for my people. So I will pay the penalty. I'll pay the consequences of their sin, which is death. He sent his only son to die on a cross for our behalf. And so the penalty is paid. Now, because the penalty is paid, all we have to do, repent, turn from our sin, stop choosing the ways of darkness, start choosing his ways, start choosing him, sending that spiritual message, if you will, Father, I choose you, I want you, I desire you, I depend upon you. Now those are just the first, there's a few highlights from the first 2 chapters of Genesis. This idea that what we would call evil or sin, these things play a role in creation. They play a role as we play out our lives in this world. Now there will come a time where sin will be done away with. But between now and then, we have an opportunity to demonstrate to the Father that I'm willingly choosing you. So that way in eternity, if we're with the Father, then that choice has significance. He didn't just bring us up there and say, okay, you're in, right? He gave us that choice. Now he knows that the new kingdom is populated with people that want to be there, that want to choose him, that want to walk in his ways, and not those who want to rebel against him. So let's look at a couple of passages. Isaiah 42, let me turn there. going to be our half Torah portion. Excuse me. So Isaiah 42, verses 5. Let's start there. And actually, it's quite a long passage. 42, verse 5 through 43:11. There was a verse I want to touch on. 43:11. I lost my verse. Bear with me here. Here we go. So Isaiah 42:5. Thus says God Adonai, who created the heavens and spread them out, who stretched out the earth and all that grows from it, who gives birth to the people on it, and spirit to those who walk on it. I, Adonai, called you righteously. I took hold of you by the hand. I shaped you and made you a covenant for the people, to be a light to the nations, so that you can open blind eyes, free the prisoners from confinement, those living in darkness from the dungeon. All right, we'll stop there. So what is Isaiah's message here? Isaiah's message, or God's message through Isaiah is probably a better way to phrase that. He declared that part of his redemption plan calls for his people to be a light, or not physical light, right? We're not caused to just physically shine, but to be a spiritual light, to be a source of spiritual enlightenment that leads to life, right? We're supposed to reflect the Father. We're supposed to reflect the Son. When people look at us, they should see the Father. They should see the likeness of the Son operating through us, right? We're to be that or, that light unto the nations. So that means we are called to be a missionary people. We're not called to just sit in boxes, hide out in our own little communities, our own little cliques. We're supposed to get out and interact with the world because we're that light. We're supposed to be beacons for people who live in darkness, to show them the light of the Father, to show them a spiritual reality that they might not have access to. I shouldn't say have access to, but haven't been walking in. So we're calling, in essence, we're calling the nations to choose the Father and his ways. We do this by being living examples, by explaining to people, teaching them the gospel message, right? All these things, but we interact with the world around us in an effort to point them back to the Father and his light. Now, Matthew 28. Let's kind of drive this point home. Let's find this passage. Matthew 28. Matthew 28. All right, verses 19 and 20. Let's read this here. It says, we call this the Great Commission, right? Therefore go and make people from all nations into disciples, or Talmudim, immersing them into the reality of the Father, the Son, and the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And remember, I will be with you always, yes, even until the end of the age. The call to make disciples is not just a command to preach and teach information. Right? We're not just communicating information from a book. It's more than that. We're not just giving them information of the gospel. We are to guard and keep his commandments. Right? Let's take another look at that. Teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. Right? We have to guard. We have to protect his commandments. This isn't passive. This is an active idea. and we diligently keep them in view and perform them, right? Because when we keep them in front of our eyes, they keep a measure of importance. You know, as I walk my faith out, I've noticed a pattern. If I get distracted with things of the world, with the cares of life, right? If I get distracted with what's going on and I don't stay focused in His Word and in His precepts, then it's very easy for these things to fall by the wayside. And it happens. We're not perfect, but that's not an excuse either. When we don't keep Father as the focus, when we don't keep His Word as the focus, His Torah as the focus, then we just give ourselves to other things. And these things usually always lead us further and further away from the Father. So we have to diligently keep them in view, to perform them, to do them, to make them an active part of our life and existence. And when we do that, we become this shining light, this ore, right? This reflection, if you will, of the spiritual reality of the Father. We become a beacon of hope that points to the Father. So what does this have to do with Genesis? God created the universe by design. In His design, we see a balance of what we would call opposites. Light, darkness, two opposing spiritual realities, the potential for sin and evil. He created all this, and He said it was good. He didn't say evil was good, but the potential which brings freedom and choice, that's good. Light and darkness, peace and evil, natural and spiritual realities that give us that freedom of choice. So, we bear the responsibility to not only choose God's path for our life, but to help those around us, right? A missionary people, the Great Commission, to go. We help the people make that same choice by showing them the way, right? Let me show you the Father. Let me show you His Torah. Let me reveal to you His Spirit, because I have a relationship with Him, and His Spirit lives in me, and I'm a reflection of His Spirit. We're called to shine with the Father's brightness in this dark world so that others would be drawn to the Creator of the universe. And that is what Genesis, or B'resheet, is all about. It's the foundation of things. So we can be tempted when tragedy strikes to say, God, why would you allow this to happen? And then we go down the road of starting to doubt God or become angry at Him because we don't understand why these things exist. But fundamentally, evil exists in the world because there has to be a potential for choice. And when somebody else chooses to walk in a way opposite of God and that impacts us, can't be angry at the Father. What we have to do is we have to continue to choose His ways and do the best we can to help others to choose His ways. Looking forward to the hope that in His coming kingdom, we will find our place there. And not only that, but in that time, there will be a place without sin, without death. Because we have demonstrated in our lives, we are choosing to be there. Right? It gives consequence and merit to our choice to be with the Father. So that is just a few thoughts from Parsha B'resheet, and we will continue our study through the Torah as we kind of look at some of these highlights from the different portions as we go through the year. So I hope to see you all again very soon. Blessings and shalom.